I'm Daryl Anderson. I currently am studying at Grey School of Art and I've been there for the past almost 5 years. My practice deals with ancestry and the concept of forgotten and how we could reconnect to our forgotten heritage. I deal a lot with film and photography, a lot of photo manipulation and film manipulation. I'm also really interested in installation and experience. I personally have like a lot of spiritual connection to my family. Unfortunately, a lot of the females on my side, like for example, my grandmother and my great granny, and that I have not had a lot of time with them, but I feel very strongly connected to them, especially on my father's side. My mother's too, but my father's side more so. Through my practice, I decided to sort of begin my own spiritual journey, noting sort of my experiences with my grandmother. I used to have a lot of vivid dreams with her, and she used to come and visit me through lights, which is a bit of an odd one, but there we go. I have a lot of intuitive family members as well. For example, my mum is a healer, but as well on my father's side with the women, I have a great grandmother, my great granny Duncan, who is from Portsoy up in Scotland, which is a little fishing village. She ran a local inn called the Shore Inn for like numerous years, but as well as being a very community-based person, she brought a lot of people together. She also was the person that people used to seek for helping with childbirth. For like they used to come and get her for like safe delivery. I think that a lot of my family always say that she's a healer, which is quite a nice thing, but I feel like it's sort of something that's passed down in my family. Unfortunately, though, obviously I didn't get to meet this lovely woman, and I actually didn't know about her until I was in my 20s, really. No one had ever sort of mentioned her until that point, and until I was sort of like looking into discovering this side of my family that was sort of forgotten. So I started joining Facebook groups that were located like in Portsoy, and found a lot of like unseen photographs and stories and people who I actually didn't know that I was partly related to through this Facebook group. Since a younger age, I think I've always been a bit intuitive. I'm a very big empath, which is my, I think, calling with spirituality. I think I connect a lot to my friends if I know, or my family even. I can sort of sense if something's wrong. It is something that I feel like just sewn through my family, though. I think even my mother's side, because she does Reiki and is a very spiritual person as well, and I've sort of just grown up with that energy about, even though it wasn't something that my mum and I didn't delve into until I was in my 20s, and she's well into her 40s, 50s now at this point. Sometimes, even though like the signs in that are there, it takes a while for people to, you know, realize that influence and then take it on. But I think it's people just live it, you know, and I think I've been living it since I was younger, this sort of spiritual energy. And it's really nice now that I've found something that I can integrate into my practice and use that further. I take a lot of inspiration from obviously history within Scottish witchcraft and ritualistic practices that sort of, it started off with like sort of Celtic and pagan rituals that I was researching, but I found that I source a lot of imagery and concepts that I can use within my own practice to create my own ritualistic practices. As much as I love seeing other rituals, I try and integrate them into my practice so that I can add a little bit of a twist onto them. Ritual is where I focus my practice on, though. I think the act of ritual is really interesting. I love the act of repetition, that sort of mirrored image cycles, that sort of never-ending loop is something that really interests me, and I really love like that repetitive motion. I think it sort of makes like a trance-like state. So that's sort of where I focus my point on. I think it can make some really interesting films through, you know, the act of ritual. I've talked about obviously my family heritage, and that was one of the main focal points when I was doing this in second year, was specifically my family heritage. It's developed further than that. I kind of, I'm trying to create more community-based work, but when that started, the concept of mirror image was the start, like came up for me, just because a lot of people used to say that my granny and I were very similar, and not an exact, obviously, mirror image, but in a sense. But I particularly am really interested in mirror scrying. The reason why is because also I found that it's known within my family that you can see my great granny Duncan within the mirrors still of the shore-in. Apparently people can clock her, and that is what made me research into mirror scrying, which is basically just a medium that people used to use to sort of detect like premonitions or receive messages or visions. And that was a really key focal point for me with the start of my practice into the witch. I have a fair few artists that deal with dreamlike states that I was really inspired by, including John Cocteau. He did films like Blood of a Poet and Orpheus. Orpheus is one that really inspired my practice. He created this film where this gentleman goes through mirrors by putting on these latex gloves and travels through them and creates these portals. And I thought that was really interesting with the concept of mirror scrying, creating a portal to create these sort of trance-like state rituals. Another artist who deals with that quite a lot is Maya Deren. I'm really interested in her film The Witch's Cradle, which she also made with, I think, Marcel Duchamp. He was at least helping her create this film, but it's a very short experimental film where she creates this trance-like state with thread as well, like wrapping around her, and it's all this crazy chaotic imagery, and the way that she cuts and edits it's really interesting to me. I really like the way that using editing sound can allow you to like influence and create sort of an eeriness and an atmospheric focal point within videos. I also take a lot of my influences from film, poetry and imagery. Films specifically, I'm really interested in things like Arcadia, that was directed by Paul White. It was that documentary / experimental film that he created using not only imagery he was creating but found imagery. So I think that's like there's always a nice balance between the two. I also am really inspired by the concept of generations, of course, but I am really interested in finding how different generations dealt with spirituality and how they portrayed it. Most of my work in third year was focused around the Victorian era. I was really interested in seances, spirit cabinets, covering mirrors, like their whole process is around death and why they were so fearful but also so fascinated by it. Specifically spirit cabinets and how they used to conduct shows really interests me. So that was sort of my focal point, is looking at generations and looking at how they deal with these differently. My first film was literally just called The Mirror. It created a black mirror inspired by John Dee's spirit mirror, and I used that as like a key prop to not just to connect all of my films sort of together, but as a way of entering sort of this weird, otherworldly, uncanny realm. Basically, my first film was black and white experimental, basically where the antagonist is delving into a quest to sort of connect to a figure that's only shown through like a few photographs that are laid ceremoniously in front of a mirror. And then as the ritual began, the black glaze across the mirror started to ripple, and then it sort of creates like this other portal. And that's sort of where I began. It was my first ever film. It was a little bit nerve-wracking, but I really enjoyed it, and that's what fueled my practice into what it is now. I never thought I'd ever be a film artist, but it's something I feel like there's so much you can do with film and how much you can manipulate through it. I think it's a really great point to deal with the witch and to deal with concepts like that. And then after that, I continued delving into the concept of mirror scrying. And then I interlinked what I did in that first film, but sort of added a twist onto it, which is where the cleanse came from. The cleanse wasn't to deal with ancestry in a sense. At this point, I was researching into C.G. Jung's concept of the shadow and the ego, and that's where I created my 2-part film. And it was also the first film I did in colour, which I quite enjoyed. But on one side there is, it's portrayed of like a young woman who is staring into her basically her own vanity mirror, and she begins her nightly routine of trying to achieve the clean look. And on the other side there was a shadow, a shadowy figure moving with her in sync, copying her movements as if the shadow and her were one, until the shadow interrupts the ritual, which is when things start to get a little bit weird and eerie. It was also the first time I'd ever played about with sound, and how that can affect the film and how it can affect how people are feeling and how much it can sort of stick with them. I used one of my grandmother's favourite songs throughout that film, and had slowed it down so much so that it sounded like this horrible, like gut-wrenching gurgling. And it's actually that "Oh My Love" song by the Wright brothers, I think it is, or the Righteous brothers, I can't remember the name, but everyone kept asking me what I'd use for the soundbite for it because they were so confused as to what it was, because it was similar and familiar, and that's what was sticking with them, was the fact that it's like, why do I recognize this silly bit? And why is it freaking me out so? And it's nice to, it's good to see, you know, how using parts like that can leave lingering traces on people and make them think about things. That's what then influenced my most recent project, the Premonitions Cabinet, where I really wanted to leave a lasting effect on the viewer. The Premonitions Cabinet was, again, mirroring a bit like ancestry, but not focusing solely on my ancestry. It was focusing on that of the concept of being forgotten and how that could then be relayed, you know, not just to those who are already forgotten, you know, the ones that are in this black abyss, sort of floating about in this space, unnamed, unknown. It could also happen to us, and that was the whole point of that film, was to sort of make people think, like, come out thinking, oh, like, as if they'd just like been influenced by that and like left a little touch of, oh, maybe I should research into my own heritage, history, you know. I was really interested at that point, because we were doing the pre-degree show then, about installation and immersiveness within my work. And so that's why I created a spirit cabinet, but I called it the Premonitions Cabinet, where I painted it black, had it blacked out basically, and made the viewer feel like they were sort of in this weird encapsulated space, as if they were the one that had been forgotten whilst watching this film. As much as I like focusing on Scottish culture and images that are from our own heritage and, you know, symbols from, you know, Celtic or pagan influences, I also am really interested in how these are related to other cultures as well. And the red thread is actually, I think it is, I want to say Japanese folklore, I'm pretty sure. Basically, they believe that there is this thing referred to as the red thread of fate. Basically, they believe that we are all connected through red thread, as if before we were even beings on this earth, we were meant to meet. So, for example, you and I have this red thread that we were meant to sort of connect together at some point in our life, whether or not that's a long period of time or a short period of time. You'll always be connected to that person. And I really liked that whole concept. The reason that image is sort of relayed is because we have a vein from the tip of our pinkies straight to our heart. So that's why the pinky promise is formed, is because you're actually making a promise connected to your heart, like you're wholeheartedly making that promise. And that's what they believe is that sort of line from your heart is this sort of red thread connecting to you, to all those people that you have been, who you are, you know, who you're bound to meet. Yeah, I just think that's really interesting. So that's why I incorporated that into my practice a fair amount. I left to go to New Zealand because I felt really burnt out after my third year. I felt like my connection to my practice was sort of fraying a bit. I don't know what it was. I just felt like I needed a break. And you know what, that's perfectly fine for people to need that from their practice, you know. It is something that sometimes you do feel like, especially in this modern age where you feel like you really need to like produce work and keep producing, and there's that sort of stress of, if I'm not posting constantly or, you know, creating constantly, you're going to lose it. But at the end of the day, like, it does cause this sort of burnout feeling. And I unfortunately hit that at the final point of third year. So that's why I decided to take a year out and go and travel a wee bit. And I'd gone to visit New Zealand before, but hadn't experienced as much of it as I would like, because I was only there for a few weeks. So I went across to go there for a year. And as I was there, I experienced so many different parts of this, it's such an empowering country to be in, with their sense of spirituality and sense of self. The way that they are connected to one another, the way that they relay stories, the way that they connect themselves to their land is just beautiful. I had some really great experiences whilst I was across there, with some exhibitions as well. I went and visited Auckland Art Gallery at one point, and they had this exhibition on, basically with a lot of thematics dealing with the witch, which was great. I also, when you walked in, there was this huge tapestry. It's mainly embedded within Tongan culture. It's something that I'm writing about currently in my dissertation. They, honestly, like 9-10 foot tapestry up on this wall. It was huge, and I just was feeling so empowered. And when I finally researched into the process and the work that was there, it was just beautiful to see these communities and collectives of women still claiming their ritualistic rights and heritage, even as much of, you know, the effects that colonialism and that's had on New Zealand, and a lot of things that were stripped from them. It's lovely to see, and really empowering to see how they are still working through that, and, you know, creating contemporary art through that. And it was just a really humbling experience, but also it made me reconnect and love, like, it made me think about my practice and made me sort of realize that I wanted to come back and do a final project. Not a final project, but do a project within Grays. Like, I felt like I needed that break to feel my energy and feel my love and feel my sort of pot, if you will, with artistic influences and inspiration that I got from across there, and how their culture relates so much to Scotland. Not like mirroring, but, you know, how they deal with rituals similarly, but how we've sort of forgotten ours, and how I could reclaim those through my practice. That's sort of what it inspired me to do. I'm really interested in will walking, like, fully, wholeheartedly. I feel like that in itself is a ritual, and the way that the women are working together in sync to batter this wool into tweed, and how they sing to keep each other in rhythm, but also it just creates like a connective energy. But you only really see now demonstrations of it, and it's usually generally older women that are doing it. And I think that's such a heart-wrenching thing, because when I saw that comparison to the Tongan culture and how embedded it is in their current culture, how imperative it is, like the stuff that they create, Nagatu, it's spelled Ngatu, it is basically like when they're born, they're wrapped in it. When someone gets married, it's the first thing that they like line their bed with. When they die, they get wrapped in it as well. And it's such a imperative thing in their culture that they actually create groups with these women and meet weekly and create this community where elders tell like, you know, generation stories and relay all these past things that have been relayed to them, you know, and continue to connect like this culture and these people together and create a really safe sense of community and a safe space for women. And I think that's such a shame that we don't really have that, because I know if there was something running in my local community centre where we could learn wool walking and get to know past past rituals or past, you know, practices, you know, things that have been slowly depleting in our cultures, like I think I would love to go and attend one of those, but it's just not something that is really accessible here, which is such a shame. So that's one thing I would love to do with contemporary art, is to allow these communities to sort of be made, or these connections to be formed, so that they're not forgotten. Currently I'm working on a project called The Potential Seed. It's sort of dealing with death, fertility and rebirth. I'm hoping to do some wool walking maybe in that, but I'd really like to take my practice further and possibly do some community art. Like I would absolutely love to do that. I think it's what my practice is currently calling me towards. So unfortunately, I don't think I would love to have been able to do some community work this year, but obviously with everything going on, it's not been really accessible at all. So I really would like to do that in the future. I'd love to create, even to do like workshops with women, you know, or with anyone who's willing to come and join, you know, who's willing to learn about, you know, spirituality and not just that, but, you know, make these connections and create these safe bonds and be able to sort of reclaim something that we've not totally forgot, but it's changed so much, you know, in our past, not even 100, 200 years, like we've completely shifted, you know. Sometimes I feel like as much as it's good to get workout through, you know, physically doing your artwork, you know, I work well with putting sometimes my ideas in my head into words, and I really enjoy doing that through poetry. It's also something I'm working on this year. My poetry always comes very naturally whilst I'm working. I actually started a poem whilst I was in New Zealand, and I'm still working on it now. It just like, I'll have moments where a line will come in my head and I save them in my notes on my phone is where I like usually start doing them. But I think it does work cohesively, especially when you're working with film. I really appreciate the spoken word and how much you can sort of get from wordplay and, you know, hearing tones of someone's voice. And I really enjoy featuring even slight parts from a poem in a film if it's underlaid under a lot of sound. There is slight parts where I'll take bits and use them within my film. So I feel like I like to interlink my work and try and make it all sort of connect. So I feel like my poetry, as much as sometimes I'll post it separately, I think it's all intertwined and interwoven. I think I come from a family of storytellers, you know. My family are all very good at relaying stories, and I think as awful as they are at relaying other, you know, like things about my past heritage, you know, they are good at storytelling. But I think that, yeah, I would consider myself a storyteller, something I would like to take on anyway. It's something very inspired by, and I feel like there's so much that can come from storytelling. We see that in our everyday, you know, and I would love to focus that as part of my practice. Yeah.